Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy. Welcome to our YouTube channel. This week we're going to talk about an exercise-based prevention program for ACL injuries. Now, ACL injuries are really common in sports, and we also know that non-contact mechanisms are about 80% more likely to cause an ACL injury. Now, there are several risk factors associated with those non-contact mechanisms, so much so that the International Olympic Committee put forth a consensus statement which kind of identified the various ACL risk factors. And there are four major categories. There are external factors, internal factors, hormonal factors, and biomechanical factors. Now, hey guys, thanks for watching our videos, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We can't really have much of an impact on external factors like footwear and playing surface, for example, playing on a turf with a cleat, right? We don't have very much impact on internal factors like a smaller ACL, a wider Q angle, for example, in females. And we also don't have an impact on hormonal factors, which are related to females and the increased laxity of the knee ligaments in the ovulatory phase. But one factor that we can certainly have an impact on is biomechanical factors. Okay, so in the biomechanical factors, the knee injury to the knee occurs because there are multiple forces acting collectively on the knee. Okay, and these biomechanical factors, the knee being an intermediate joint, it's really impacted by what goes on at the foot and what goes on at the hip. And so essentially, what athlete needs, what we're addressing when we're addressing biomechanical factors, is we're addressing all of the segments of the kinetic chain and then essentially making sure that the athlete is able to absorb, distribute, and transfer load optimally. If load is not transferred or absorbed or transferred or distributed optimally at one joint, that knee is going to have a greater impact. So there is definitely a need to factor in several elements in an exercise-based prevention program for ACL injuries. So we're going to take a look at what that would look like. So fundamentally, joint range of motion is important. The knee is only part of the kinetic chain, right? And we need all of these segments to move relative to each other. And for that to happen, all of the joints need to have the range of motion required to do that. So ankle mobility is going to be important and hip mobility is going to be important. Now, I discuss ankle mobility at length in another video on the channel, and I also discuss how to assess hip mobility or hip stiffness relative to ACL on another video on the channel as well. So let's look at what we would do now to increase hip internal rotation mobility, because remember that internal rotation is important to decelerate and absorb the rotation of the pelvis and the trunk, right? So if we don't have that internal rotation mobility, we're going to create a situation where the athlete has to move their center of mass laterally relative to the knee joint, and that's risky business. So how do we increase internal rotation range of motion for the hip? So we can use a band here to create just some lateral distraction, and we're getting a bit of a posterior glide as well. And we get our athlete into quadruped position, get him into hip internal rotation against that band traction, and then he's just going to mobilize, rock the hips back and forth. Just working on mobilizing that hip into internal rotation. Now, whenever we're doing these mobilization exercises, we want to mobilize for 1 to 2 minutes. So he could do one set of 1 minute here, he could do 2 sets of 1 minute, he could do 1 set of 2 minutes, depending on how much restriction you have there and how much release effect you want to get. Now, an important thing that we want to do after we create range of motion is we want to work on dissociation. In order to actually have a joint, you need each of the articulating surfaces of that joint, each component of that joint to be able to move independently from one another. That's dissociation. So we need the femur to be able to move on the pelvis and the pelvis to be able to move on the femur in order to actually have a hip joint. So now that we've increased range of motion, we want to move the pelvis on the femur, because in sports and in changing directions, essentially the hip has to serve as the central pivot for movement. So we're going to get him to dissociate movement of his pelvis on his femur. So we're going to get our athlete into a staggered position, and then he can cross his arms over the chest. That usually helps. And what he wants to do is he wants to rotate his pelvis on his femur. So as he rotates out, he doesn't want that knee to cave in. He wants to keep that hip stable, and he's just moving the pelvis on the femur inside and out. So rotating that pelvis on that femur. And you'll see what tends to happen is you got to come in and control this, because if he's got good thoracic rotation but stiff hips, he's going to rotate the torso but not rotate the pelvis, right? So we want to make sure that he's really turning and moving that pelvis on that stable hip, really creating that dissociation and using that hip joint as the central pivot point to move the pelvis on. So now that we've created space and we've dissociated our movement, we actually want to work on deceleration mechanics. So kind of like now we're associating that movement along the kinetic chain. So a great place to start is always to work on deceleration. So we're kind of creating rotation and having our athlete decelerate that kind of rotation torque. So we can do side shuffles with rotation here, where our athlete is going to hold a light, so a light bar in front, and he's going to shuffle and rotate and back and forth. And so every time he does this, he's needing to decelerate his torso rotating. So really swing that weight across as you come across, swing and then absorb. Don't stop in the middle. Yes, there we go. So really needing to absorb that each time as the torso and hips rotate, the torso and pelvis rotate over his hips. He's having to absorb that. All right, so to recap what goes into an exercise-based prevention program for ACL injuries, one, we want to give the athlete the joint range of motion so that he can have the proper kinematics to associate that movement along the kinetic chain. So we need all those joints to move properly. Then we want to give them the appropriate proprioceptive information so that they can dissociate that movement. Namely, we looked at having the pelvis move on the femur so that the hip joint becomes the central pivot for movement. And then third, we want to improve how forces are absorbed, distributed, and transferred in a definitive sequence of deceleration. So we do that in our mobilization, activation, and integration sequences, so we can work on all the aspects of that kinetic chain movement, and we're also exposing those tissues and structures to similar stresses than what they will encounter in the dynamic environment of sports. So make sure you stay tuned to our next video next week, and if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. Click the link.